Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. This is Lisa Carty from OCHA in New York today, the Director of Humanitarian Finance and Resource Mobilization. Thanks so much for your patience as we just made sure all of the technicalities were in order. We're so happy to have you with us all this morning, and we're actually doing this briefing. We hope it'll be the first in a series of such briefings. We're doing it at your suggestion. It was a request that actually came up at a number of our various advisory group meetings in the course of the spring at the ODSG and the Surf Advisory Group and the Pool Fund Working Group meetings. You had all expressed a bit of an interest in hearing more from us on a regular basis about how our work is progressing, and we're really very happy to have this opportunity and very grateful that so many of you have called in today. So our plan is to do about a 20-25 minute update with a few slides that if you're on the phone, they've been sent to you ahead of time. Hopefully you have them on hard copy or on a screen, and if you're in WebEx, you have them up on a screen in front of you. I'm joined by my colleagues, Marcy Vagoda from our partnership branch, who is in Geneva, and Lisa Doughton from the Pool Fund branch, who's with me here in New York, and Dirk-Jan Omtegeits, who's with our Humanitarian Finance and Strategy Unit, also here in New York. So if we do about 20-25 minute presentation, we're hoping that's going to leave us with about half an hour for Q&A, and we'll say a little bit more when we get to the Q&A section about exactly how that will be run. If we can't manage all of your questions in this particular time frame, we can certainly get back to you on a bilateral basis to follow up. So have no concerns if you start to feel that our time gets a little pressed. But before we get started, I just wanted to make one point. I was reflecting actually last night as I was thinking about this meeting that it's been about a year since I've come to OCHA in this role, and about 18 months now since Mark Lowcock shared a little bit his thinking on how the humanitarian financing system could work a bit differently. And certainly for me and for my colleagues here at OCHA, it's been a very exciting period to think about the role OCHA can play in helping be a part of that evolution and really building on the different skills and assets and accomplishments and contributions of so many of you who are on the phone with us this morning. You know, a lot of what we've been able to do has truly been a result of the way we've been working and the partnership with the NGO community, with UN and other multilaterals, with our government partners, and we're absolutely committed to continuing to work with you in that way. So we very much appreciate the spirit of collaboration. We appreciate that you push us to do more and do better, and we look forward to continuing to move ahead. So without any further delay, let me go first to Marcy in Geneva, who's going to provide a little bit of the contextual picture for us, the bigger picture of where we stand right now on the resource mobilization side. So Marcy, over to you. Marcy, you may be on mute. We can't hear you.
Okay. Where's the terminal?
Hang on here 1 second, colleagues. We're going to sort out what's going on.
Hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Go ahead, Marcy.
Okay, great. You can hear me now. Great. I'm going to touch briefly on 3 areas. First, where we are on funding to the humanitarian response plans. Secondly, a quick update on 2019 high-level events and a preview of the 2020 GHO launches. And then I'll turn to OCHA's income, including to the pool fund. Next slide. This is an excerpt from the Global Humanitarian Overview monthly update, which I trust that many, if not all of you, will have seen. And the key point here is to highlight that with only less than 4 months left in 2019, the HRPs are only about 30% funded. The gap between the requirements and the funding is obviously large, and now in September, the situation is actually worse in both absolute and relative terms than the last several years. That said, I do want to emphasize that 2018 was an exceptional year in terms of early disbursement and reporting of funding. Now, insofar as humanitarian aid budgets are largely stable, we're expecting to see considerable funding committed and dispersed in the fourth quarter, and I would want to emphasize the importance of reporting to OCHA's financial tracking service, because that is where this data comes from. During the Q&A, if there's interest, I can speak about what has changed since the beginning of the year in terms of requirements. Next slide. This slide highlights the gap between requirements, which is the blue line on the top, and funding, which is the darker line on the bottom. And what you see here is that while funding has continued to increase, again, due to donor generosity, it's not keeping pace with requirements. Just to give a sense of how those requirements have increased, when the GHO for 2015 was launched, about 58 million people were identified as in need. And where it stands now is that there are almost 150 million people in need. We're certainly working on advocacy and outreach, often with yourselves, to reduce this gap and to diversify the donor base. And colleagues in a few moments will indeed be speaking about other ways that we aim to address the needs and reduce requirements through anticipatory action and anticipatory financing. Next slide, please. A quick update on the 2019 high-level resource mobilization events. The Yemen event, which was held here in Geneva, the pledge fulfillment is 47%. We expect to see a sharp increase in the next couple of weeks. So I think that over the course of the month and in the context of the GA, we will see this rise sharply. So I'll leave that there. In terms of Syria, we have independent pledge tracking because the Syria conference attracts not only humanitarian but also development funding. And a report which will come out just ahead of the GA shows that 92% of the pledges have been fulfilled. That having been said, the Syria Humanitarian Response Plan is only about a third funded. Again, that may be an issue of reporting. And then finally, the Conference on Ending Sexual and Gender-Based Violence, the political, the policy, the operational commitments are as important as the funding commitments. We will have a clear picture of commitments made about the end of the first quarter of 2020, because a lot of that funding was in the form of unearmarked or softly earmarked funding. There will be events that will touch on each of these themes during the GA in the next couple of weeks. And finally, in terms of the Global Humanitarian Overview for 2020, this will be launched on the 4th of December. We will have 5 simultaneous launches in Geneva, in Brussels, in Berlin, in London, and in Washington, D.C. So over the course of the next month, you can look out for more information on that. Next slide, and my final slide. Turning to funding to OCHA. In terms of OCHA's own program budget, and including $38 million currently being negotiated, our predicted income is about $246 million. We're very close to our income target. We would like to meet that income target, and so we do encourage the donors to come forward as soon as possible about additional 2019 funding, as well as 2020 planned contributions. In terms of the pooled funds, our aim is to exceed last year's record-breaking income. With more, we can do more. For SURF, including funding that is under negotiation, our predictable income would reach close to $500 million. With those donors who have indicated the intent to contribute more, and if others contribute the same, we can exceed last year's record-breaking income. So we look forward to working with you on that. And then for the country-based pooled funds, again, there's funding that is being negotiated. The ambition really is to exceed $1 billion this year. During the Q&A, I can come back to the point of which particular country-based pooled funds especially need funding, but right now I would hand over to Lisa Doughton. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcy, and that segues very nicely into from income to allocations in SURF and country-based pooled funds. So next slide, please. So this slide shows you the update over the last 3 months. So June, July, August, the allocations that the SURF and CBPF teams have been able to facilitate. So the total allocations for the year for SURF so far is $474 million, and for country-based pooled funds is $514 million. So just as a percentage, over the summer while everyone was on leave, the percentage of allocations was 34% for SURF and 48% for CBPF, recognizing that these are teams both in headquarters and in the field, especially for country-based pooled funds, the humanitarian finance units in the field. So just to zoom in on it, SURF has allocated through the rapid response a total of $84 million to 11 countries. And just to quickly mention those, Myanmar, El Salvador, Ethiopia, Guatemala, Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, Bangladesh, Democratic Republic of Congo, Haiti, and most recently the Bahamas. And just a couple things to mention here. The Bahamas, $1 million has now been decided to focus on protection logistics. There is also a potential for the ERC is amenable to a rapid response allocation to DPRK should the assessments following Cyclone Ling Ling that crossed the southern provinces show that there's a need for rapid response. And then most recently, as of last night, the ERC has approved an allocation of $1.6 million to Libya to support UNHAS. This is important because SURF helped kickstart that operation in Libya a year ago. Several donors also put funding in, but they find themselves really at a real deficit at the moment, and all 90% of the humanitarian actors rely upon the UNHAS to move around the country. Many of you will have participated in Wednesday's webinar on the underfunded, so I won't go into details. However, just to note that $75 million was allocated during the second round, and together with the $125 million allocated earlier this year, that makes $200 million allocated to underfunded emergencies, which is the largest ever since SURF has been operating with a grant function. So to move on to country-based pooled funds, same back. Yeah, thank you. Country-based pooled funds allocated since June $244.5 million, $158 million through standard allocations to Afghanistan, Iraq, Myanmar, OPT, South Sudan, Sudan, Syria, and Ukraine. And then a total of almost $86 million was allocated through reserve allocations to the following countries: Central African Republic, DRC, Iraq, Myanmar, Pakistan, Somalia, Sudan, and the Syria Cross-Border Fund, which was formerly the Turkey Fund, and Yemen. And just a couple of highlights on country-based pooled funds. So in July, Ukraine received put an allocation of $3.2 million out. This will target households with disabled members and the most vulnerable elderly people that are closest to the contact line, half of which will go to the government-controlled areas and half of which will go to non-government-controlled areas. The other point to note is the closure of the Pakistan Humanitarian Fund. So there was a letter from the UN Resident Humanitarian Coordinator to donor governments within Pakistan informing them of the decision to close the Pakistan Humanitarian Fund by December 2020. Now I should also say, you don't need to move back, but on the previous slide, there were two websites. So if you want to have any additional information on the allocations, you may look there. Of course, we have the question and answer period following this as well. So on this slide, the country-based pooled fund managing agent consolidation roadmap. So many of you will be aware of what happened from January until through the second and now into the third quarters. What is notable from this last 3-month period, since we saw many of you at the Pooled Fund Working Group, in early August, UNDP officially signed off on the Joint Action Plan, which is a very detailed plan and has been localized in each of the 4 countries where this managing agent transition is taking place from UNDP to OCHA. And so we will ensure that there's a smooth transition there, and UNDP is very to ensure the closure and the full transfer by January. On that note, we've been really engaging from headquarters, but also in the field, in providing missions to the 4 countries, including there was a workshop on the consolidation of this function with OCHA fund managers and another staff member from those funds in Addis Ababa in late August. And there they were discussing programmatic, financial, and operational challenges and how to work through some of those. So it seems to be going very, very well and smoothly. Obviously, with any kind of such big change, there will be some bumps along the road, but there's a full interest by both parties and all parties that are operating on this and working on it to make sure it takes place. And lastly, on this slide, I just wanted to mention that the ERC has allocated additional funding to help support the work associated with the additional workload that will be coming to OCHA, which is a 30% workload increase. And so there will be additional support to hire 1 additional finance person, an additional compliance, and another support staff to really help ensure that this rolls out very nicely. Next one, please. And my last slide is on pooled funds and innovation. Some of you will be aware of the blockchain technology pilot that we've been thinking about and talking about and working on for country-based pooled funds. We're working with an organization called Disburse, which is a fund management platform for development and humanitarian aid, working very closely with them on trying to put together, or actually implementing now, a pilot in 2 countries, in OPT and Iraq, and looking at last year's data and looking to see how much more smoothly and reducing transaction costs and reducing the risks associated with fund transfer, how if we had used it last year, what effect would that have had? So this, we are hoping that will show minimizing transfer times, transaction costs, exchange rate losses, and other transaction-related risks. On the 4 priority areas, which all of you will be very familiar of, I'm sure, just a little bit of an update. These are to be incorporated within SURF and country-based pooled funds. Just as a reminder, it's support for women and girls, programs targeting disabled people, education, protracted crises, and other aspects of protection. There is a strong focus on that with this round of the underfunded emergencies through SURF. And each of the teams, through their prioritization strategies and the plans, had noted how they were addressing these 4 priorities, or if they were not addressing them using SURF, how they would be addressed with other funding. Just a couple of examples on that. In Bangladesh, SURF funds will be used to target interventions to support reproductive health and protection of women and girls, including GBV survivors. In Eritrea, SURF-funded interventions really have a strong emphasis on assisting the most vulnerable groups, including women, girls, and people with disabilities. And as such, female households and persons with disabilities are targeted strongly, as they're disproportionately affected by the impact of drought in Eritrea. And an example of complementarity I'll give also with education is Sudan, where UNICEF has education supplies that will be distributed to NGOs that are funded by the Sudan Humanitarian Fund. also taking into account that education in Burkina Faso and in Venezuela is being funded by the Education Cannot Wait Fund, and in Afghanistan, the underfunded emergencies, in Afghanistan, the Humanitarian Fund, the OCHA Humanitarian Fund, will be providing funding for education and therefore not included in the SURF underfunded allocation. So that's to highlight some of the complementarity. On the multi-year funding through SURF, as you may be aware, there's a pilot project ongoing through the underfunded where there's an allocation of 10 million over a 2-year period to support education in Bangladesh, the Rohingya refugees. As that is just now being allocated and planned, there are no results yet to be mentioned, but of course, looking at protracted crises, the ERC wanted to ensure that in these cases where there are protracted crises and needs, that funding does go and allows these teams to plan accordingly. So we will learn many lessons from this and apply the lessons to any potential future multi-year allocations through SURF. Of course, country-based pooled funds has already been working on a multi-year basis in DRC, and one of the recent reports by NRC done jointly with OCHA shows that there are some real opportunities to roll that out more fully into some other of the humanitarian funds. So with that, although anticipatory action is the last on this slide, I will hand over to Dirk now to focus on that.
Thank you. We're making significant progress on advancing new approaches to humanitarian financing, the agenda for which was laid out in the casement lecture by the ERC. First, we're promoting and supporting the development of multi-country disaster risk pools, which just over the last week have proven to be very helpful in 2 crises. The Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility paid out 11 million to the Bahamas following the impact of Hurricane Dorian, and the African Risk Capacity paid out 22 million to Senegal for the drought, including for the first time a replica payout to the START network. Secondly, we're advocating for development financing instruments that are fit for crisis settings. Importantly, we're collaborating very closely with the World Bank on crisis response window and the design for the proposed early action window contained therein under IDA 19. We're deeply engaged in the bank's fragility, conflict and violence strategy and the IDA 19 pivot to prevention to ensure IDA 19 funds are addressing the root causes of vulnerability and recurrent crises. High-level dialogues have started to transform the development system, which increasingly takes a crisis lens, invests in prevention, and engages in fragile contexts for which it is developing new instruments for this, like the remaining engaged in conflict allocation. Finally, we're advancing anticipatory action to get ahead of forecasted shocks. Anticipatory action is, when possible, a more humane and cost-effective approach to reducing human suffering and protecting hard-won development gains in fragile places. To demonstrate proof of concept, we've identified 2 types of context where anticipatory action is most likely to be successful. One, in slow onset drought context, where there's a high degree of predictability, enough lead time to act, and interventions which, if promptly implemented, can fundamentally reduce humanitarian need. And 2, in context of communicable disease outbreaks, where early detection and treatment substantially reduces case transmission and fertility rates. We're capitalizing on a historic opportunity to pilot anticipatory action in Somalia, where we have strong country leadership and partners with deep experience, a data-rich environment, robust planning and implementation systems, and a high-level engagement by the bank, as Somalia is a firm first-mover country. 2 points on this slide. One, our work in Somalia is very much joined up with the World Bank, leveraging their analytical and financial depth. The USG was in Somalia on Wednesday and yesterday, together with Mahmoud Mohaldin, Senior Vice President of the bank, to underline this deepening partnership. Second, the pilot is designed in a collective and collaborative manner with senior engagement from the World Bank, FAO, WFP, IFRC, and START, which allows us to draw on their experience, but also be more joined up in the face of out-of-the-ordinary events that are becoming more frequent, such as the extreme drought in Somalia. Finance is triggered for anticipatory action when we expect an out-of-the-ordinary crisis, analogous to 2010-11 and 2016-17. To determine if such an event is likely, we use FuseNet Food Insecurity Forecast as a proxy for broader humanitarian need, and we use two potential thresholds. One around deterioration, if the percentage of people in IPC 3 and above is projected to increase by more than 5% and exceeds 20%, and a threshold around depth, where the percentage of people in IPC 3 and above is projected to exceed 20% and more than 2.5% of the population is projected to be in IPC 4 and above. Jointly with partners, we mapped out how a crisis escalates and what are impactful and feasible anticipatory actions. Impactful anticipatory actions fundamentally mitigate the impact and thus result in a reduced humanitarian need and protect development gains. Feasible anticipatory actions can be implemented in a timely manner. Think about a distribution of drought-resistant seeds at the right time in the planting season. We've engaged extensively with partners on the ground who have provided very valuable feedback on the anticipatory action plan. This plan is not just for SURF, but also for the World Bank Early Action Window of the CRW and other instruments. SURF will select activities that are consistent with its mandate and criteria, similarly with the CRW. So we exploit the complementarity and comparative advantage of different instruments while operating off the same framework. The plan contains three categories of interventions. Firstly, activities to prevent and mitigate a potential impact, such as provision of drought-resistant seeds to maintain food production, and the provision of fodder and targeted animal health interventions to prevent mass mortality of livestock, asset loss, malnutrition, and displacement. Secondly, activities to stabilize and protect vulnerable people, such as vertically and horizontally scaling up of cash transfers to sustain purchasing power. And finally, as we are unlikely to fully prevent a crisis, the plan also has a component to ensure operational readiness for response. Finally, we're building on the work that's been undertaken in Yemen to reduce the spread of cholera using the global cholera risk model. This tool helps forecast the spread of cholera at the government level with great accuracy using climate information and WASH infrastructure data. We're exploring if this model can be used in a range of humanitarian contexts to release finance for and dynamically plan a response. For example, standing up localized health rapid response teams that support detection and treatment of cholera outbreaks, which, if done at speed, are highly effective and relatively inexpensive ways of containing the epidemic and averting excess mortality. OCHA is now part of an alliance of partners that is exploring the development and application of climate information and weather services to forecast vector-borne diseases like cholera. Next week, Dr. Rita Cowell of the University of Maryland and Dr. Anta Yudla of the University of Florida are visiting OCHA to help us advance our thinking on anticipatory action to get ahead of epidemic cholera in humanitarian settings using this new tool.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dirk-Jan. This is Lisa Carty again, and thanks to the OCHA colleagues for the presentation. So I know we have given an awful lot of information, and there probably are multiple questions, and we're looking forward to answering them. Let me just say our team here has a little bit of flexibility at the end of the hour, so should the Q&A run a little bit long, we're certainly able to stay if some others are interested in extending the conversation by a little bit. But we will also have a mechanism by which if we cannot get to all your questions, or some of them might be better answered in a direct conversation with one of the team here, we will figure out a way to bilaterally follow up. So with that, let me go to my colleagues who are going to help us manage the Q&A, okay, and they will facilitate the discussion we'll have now. So over to my Q&A colleagues.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, colleagues. So we will do this very simply. First, we're going to start. My name is Juan. I work with the Humanitarian Financing Strategy Unit, and I'll help facilitate the Q&A. We will start with colleagues who are dialing in using their phones first. I will just open the floor for any questions. I heard at the beginning that we have colleagues on the phone from Germany, Canada, the US, Denmark, Australia, Netherlands and Ireland, but there may be others. So if you have questions, please go ahead and post them now. If two people speak on the phone at the same time, which may happen, we'll just try to apply common sense and allow whoever speaks first to continue with their questions. We'll take 2 to 3 questions first, try to get back to you on those, and then we will continue until we exhaust our time. So with no further ado, people on the phone are more than welcome now to please unmute and ask questions.
This is Andy Billow from USAID.
Go ahead, Andy.
Thanks so much, and thanks for the comprehensive presentations. Really helpful to have this update, and appreciate OCHA taking the time to provide this information. A question for Dirk-Jan in terms of the anticipatory action pilots. Our understanding was that OCHA was working on a draft operational plan in advance of potentially releasing SURF funds for the anticipatory action pilot. So we just wanted to ask what the status of that draft operational plan is, and whether there would be an opportunity for us to review and provide comments in advance of SURF funds potentially being released for this purpose. And I think sort of the concern that we have, at least at this stage, there's obviously a trade-off, I think, when we look at making investments in anticipatory action. The closer, obviously, to an emergency, the better the data is, and the further away, the less reliable the data becomes. So just sort of looking at that trade-off and the balance of those two competing, sort of mechanisms, I think is important for us to consider. And so we'd really welcome the opportunity to look more, closely at the Somalia context and have a chance to review some of the information and again, provide some comment. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. We have a couple more questions first before we turn it back to Dirk-Jan and others. Anybody else on the phone would like to ask a question?
Hi, this is Susan from Ireland. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, Susan. Go ahead.
Great. Hi, Juan. How are you? Just a couple of quick questions. The first question is on the slide 16, the skeletal anticipatory action plan. I'm just wondering how this plan was developed and who it was developed with, so whose plan is it? And you mentioned working with, obviously, the World Bank. There's a lot of work going on. I didn't quite pick up, you mentioned others like the START Fund and others. I'd just be interested to hear a bit more about how you're working with others in the field of humanitarian financing. And finally, just on the issue of the multi-year funding to the program in Bangladesh, I understand that maybe it's a bit too early to get any results, but I'm just wondering what the plan is for feeding back, because it was something that was discussed substantially in the SURF Advisory Group and also at the ODSG meeting. So when can we expect to hear the learning from that? Thank you.
Okay, we'll take one more question and then we'll try to answer those and continue. So anybody else on the phone would like to ask a question?
Yeah, hi, this is Germany, and I'm trying to ask actually 2 questions. One is pretty much in line with what was just asked as well regarding the coordination. How will you actually ensure coordination taking into consideration like the government-driven and the UN-coordinated humanitarian action, for example, concerning stakeholders like the START network and Red Cross, Red Crescent movement in the same area? And when I understand you correctly, there is an operational plan where you are going to have, of course, funding from the SURF for humanitarian stakeholders, and there is also going to be funding from the World Bank to development stakeholders and to the government, of course. So when the government has no implementing capacity, especially like in Somalia, and they rely on UN agencies to also implement the government-related anticipatory action, how are you going to tackle, let's say, this kind of coordination between humanitarian stakeholders working together with governments and humanitarian stakeholders receiving funding from the SURF? And perhaps on the triggers, last question from my side at this moment, considering that you focus on an escalation of specific needs in the context of drought and food insecurity, like the IPC 3 level. Would you really consider this still as an anticipatory work, or would you see this perhaps more like an early response instead of an anticipatory work? Thank you. Over.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, colleagues. So I'm going to hand it over to Derjan to answer the anticipatory action-related questions, and then to Lisa Doughton for the question on multi-year.
Thank you, colleagues, for a very useful question. Thank you very much for the opportunity to elaborate on those. We have drafted a skeleton plan following 2 joint missions with colleagues from the bank, but also engagement from WFP, FEO, IFRC, and the START network. They were part of those two missions to both Nairobi and Mogadishu. That skeleton plan has been put together and been provided to the humanitarian country team, which has approved the plan. We're currently in the state where we are doing additional refinement work to ensure operational readiness, and bank colleagues are doing additional work on some of the technical details on some of the projects. So that's the status of the plan. If people are interested, of course, you can have a look at the plan, but this is a plan that is a living document that we're working with colleagues on the ground on to refine and finalize. And so we've incubated together with the bank this plan, but this plan will ultimately be owned by colleagues in country. So it is their plan, but the way we have designed it and put it together in a collaborative manner with the START network, IFRC, FEO, WFP, and of course everyone on the ground means that all the dots are connected here by design. This grouping of people, of course, has a regular technical meeting to learn from each other, not just in the Somalia context, but globally, how we can advance anticipatory action and learn from best practice elsewhere. There was a question about triggers. If we were to use the triggers that we have laid out, and what we have done, and with a lot of great assistance from the bank, we've actually looked at if those triggers would have been applied retroactively. And that's a good test of whether these would have worked. And so if the triggers would have been applied retroactively, we would have dispersed finance, and the bank would have dispersed finance in October of 2016, well ahead of the crisis, and within a window of opportunity to implement and set up anticipatory action that could have mitigated the impact of that drought. So that's how we test whether we are in the anticipatory, and we're doing more examination, interrogation of whether we can move even earlier, and so we're working on kind of some data analysis that see whether there are other leading indicators. Now, the question about if the government doesn't have implementing capacity, how do you make sure this is all joined up? Again, joined up by design, by really having a very collaborative engagement with the bank and all the actors to make sure the anticipatory action plan is well coordinated and the implementation as well. Hope that answers the questions.
Okay, so I'll respond to your question, Susan, on the multi-year. So we should expect a first interim update on the Bangladesh program at the 5-month mark, which is the end of February next year. Of course, if there's anything that we receive in the meantime, we do have the Surf Advisory Group coming up in December this year, and of course the ODSG meeting as well. So anything that we have at that point, we can also communicate.
Okay, thank you so much. We'll move on to take some questions from participants in WebEx. Fire ahead.
This is Carol Krijger from the Netherlands. Could I pose a question, please?
Go ahead, Carol.
Thank you. I have kind of a follow-up question on the triggers that Dirk-Jan provided an explanation for just now. I was just wondering, you are looking at a threshold level as a trigger on the IPC 3 or 4 classification, and then you determine certain threshold level on which you would act. My question is, those are projections. Are they projected based on their relation to drought? So is there like a, how do you say that, expected rainfall pattern that would result in a certain IPC classification? Is it in that sense an indirect trigger, or do you do it also related to other incidents that may happen, such as economic crisis in Sudan, leading also to a change in IPC classification? Thank you.
Okay. Who would like to go next, please? Okay, we'll answer that question first, while more participants can think about other questions they would like to raise. So, Dirjan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Caro. The FuseNet projections are based on existing vulnerability and the history of rainfall, and the projection of the upcoming rainfall season. So, in that sense, climatic forecasts are incorporated in the forecast of FuseNet IPC data. So it is indeed, in that sense, indirect. Now, we are indeed at this point in time looking at drought shocks, because the shock type determines the most impactful intervention. If it is an economic shock, there might be a set of other interventions that might be helpful. But in the context of Somalia, and we've seen the last biggest crisis, they've been as a result of drought. Now, sometimes shocks are exacerbated by other stressors as well, and vulnerabilities are worsened in that type of context. But the shock type is important for the determination of what are impactful interventions.
Okay, thank you. I see a hand raised on WebEx, Sarah, I believe. So, Sarah, if you have a question, please go ahead. She's on the slide. Sarah, the mic is open in case you'd like to raise a question, as we see your hand raised on the chat. Okay, go ahead. Do we have any other questions from participants on WebEx? We couldn't hear Sarah. Okay, if there are no more questions, I'm going to hand it back to Lisa.
Great. Okay, well, listen, thank you. Thank you all very much for the time and for joining us this morning. We'd appreciate actually your feedback on the value of this session. We are committed to sustaining this kind of regular information flow with this group and any others who'd like to join it. So please let us know if there are ways you think we could have improved the topics, the presentations. I think you all have an email address for my colleague Jeremy, and we're welcome to take your further suggestions for how to keep this conversation going and make it most valuable to you. You know, there's lots that we're focused on. The division has quite a broad writ of responsibilities, and some of it is quite new and evolving, and a lot of it is quite challenging and involves a certain amount of problem solving. So I just want to say we do not feel that we have all the answers here, and we are very much dependent on the good guidance and insight and advice of those of you on the line and the whole broader community of people who have been working on these issues. So please, let's make sure you know that the door is open for your further inputs. As others have noted, we'll have a series of opportunities coming up later in the year with various SURF and ODSG and pool fund working group meetings where we can go a bit deeper on some of these issues, and we'll welcome your questions in the lead up to those for how we can make best use of our time together then. So I will just maybe pause for 5 seconds and see if there are any last questions or comments from anyone, and then if not, we're actually going to end earlier than we thought, which is a very efficient way for us to start our day here in New York. But let me just stop for 5-10 seconds, see if anybody wants to come in and any last thing before we sign off. So the floor is open.
Maybe this is Mariette from the Netherlands. Just to say thank you and echo your comments, Lisa, but really, we appreciate it. As you said, it was at the request of the donors, so we very much appreciated the opportunity, and to get some more insights. We'll follow up. If there's any afterwards, obviously we'll share it with them. But I think as a start and within the time slot, but very much appreciated the effort and the time you spent on this with your team. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Mette. Thanks very much. Anyone else care to intervene? Closing word? Okay, so then listen, we'll say thank you very much and wish everyone a good day, and we'll look forward to continuing to be in touch. Thank you.